Okay, and we're live now. Good afternoon once again, everyone, and welcome to another session of Childlink's uh, bi-monthly live streams where we try to discuss various issues surrounding masculinity, some of the factors that contributes towards violence against boys, and really try to have conversations that increase public awareness on these issues. So today we will be focusing on masculinity and sexuality, and we have two panelists with us here today, Vidorata Kusun and Rolanda Campbell. So Rolanda, if you would mind going first, do you mind introducing yourself and sharing a bit about who you are?
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rolanda Campbell. I am the project officer and forensic interviewer for the Child Advocacy Center Region 4. We do trauma counseling at the Child Advocacy Center. I'm sure some of you are aware. Yes, that's basically my role at the Child Advocacy Center Region 4.
Thanks so much, Rolanda. Vidya?
Yes.
Hi, so good afternoon, everyone. Akola, and Rolanda, I just need to do a wellness and grounding, just to let anyone know listening in that we're going to be talking about child sexual abuse and survivorship, and that anyone listening or watching who might be affected by it, please know you're not alone. Please feel free to reach out to ChildLink or any other organization or individual where you can get support. And especially for boys or men who might be coming across this video, please reach out for the assistance. There's nothing wrong in reaching out for assistance. So I just wanted to start with that. So I'm Vidya Kasoon, and I've been involved in the work around gender-based violence and child protection since around 1996. And the concerns that we've had around child protections, around the silence on child sexual abuse in all forms and all other forms of child abuse. We appreciate that ChildLink has taken the lead in focusing on boys, and I think the society should be very welcome to find this discussion. I've also worked on LGBT equality, LGBTIQ plus equality in different areas. And just to state that the knowledge that I bring is that I'm invoking the survivors, and in this space, male survivors of child sexual abuse. And the knowledge that I bring is based on conversations I've had with male survivors of child sexual abuse, some of whom identify as gay, some who used to identify as gay, and others who are straight or have different sexual orientations. So I think this conversation is really important, and I welcome it as it's happening in a larger conversation about masculinity and how toxic masculinity, and also moving to transformative masculinity. So thanks very much, Cola Chiling. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Vidya. Thank you both for being with us here today, and I really look forward to the conversation. I always learn a lot from these discussions, as I'm sure that a lot of persons who tune in do too. And so, just before we start out, Vidya raised a really great point to me yesterday about a lot of the labels that we tend to utilize, and just ensuring that persons have an understanding of them as we move through the process. So, as it relates to things such as being queer, we usually see the word queer being thrown around, but persons don't really understand what it encompasses. So for those who don't, it usually refers to sexual orientation or gender identity that might not be, a heterosexual or a person who abides by the assigned assigned sex they had at birth. So that's what it means when we're talking in the context of queer. And of course, sexual orientation refers to who it is that you're sexually attracted to. And of course, sexuality, that can also include sexual orientation, but it also includes your behaviors, the way in which you feel about yourself and carry yourself and things like that. So much of this will be discussed more as we go on, but those are just some helpful guiders to move us forward. So one of the first things that usually comes up when we're talking about child sexual abuse or masculinity in general is that if you are someone who identifies as gay or bisexual, you're a man, the reality is that you can often face a lot of negative stereotypes being placed on you. So, Vidya, what do you think are some ways that sexuality diverges from or plays into ideas related to traditional masculinity?
So, well, so just on expanding on that definition of sexuality, if you understand sexuality to mean not just who we're attracted to, but also the way we behave, the kind of roles we play, and the kinds of things we like to do sexually. Sometimes people talk, and it's to have this discussion that sometimes people assume that every man wants to penetrate something as part of their sexual behavior. Every male wants to do that, but that is not necessarily so, even though they might feel that they have to, right? And so there are some men who are scared of intimacy. Sexuality, intimacy is a part of sexuality, but many males are conditioned to think that, we must not engage in intimate behavior like cuddling, hugging, kissing, because that is softness. You got to do, whatever it is, and you have to be macho, portray yourself as macho. Interestingly enough, even some men who might be identified as gay subscribe to these kinds of ideas about what is macho, what is femme or feminine, effeminate, and so sexuality is really this broad spectrum. And then on top of that, we also have our beliefs about these behaviors, whether we are ashamed, the way we form relationships, whether we have outside thing, whether we get married for the face of it, whether we get married for love, what we think about cheating, so sexuality is this whole complex. And then also sexuality is informed by our own experiences. And sometimes these could be negative experiences of abuse as children. So then it reflects on our abilities to enjoy our sexuality and how we connect with ourselves. So it's this whole spectrum, and um, it's also governed by a lot of silence. So sometimes we don't talk. There's one thing portrayed in the media and in the culture, but there's a silence around these other things about how men really are. For example, Viagra is pushed at men to say that, men, you must have an erection or something is wrong. Rather than the alternative, hey, it's okay if sometimes you don't have an erection, you just feel like doing something else because you might be tired, and that's okay too. You don't need to have, so these are the things which push this whole power, it's converted into a power dynamic, so that any boy or so who's watching the media, any boy, sometimes even regardless of their own sexual orientation, might be watching me to see how this thing with a penis is supposed to behave. And when anything happens to that boy, depending on the age of the boy, like if it's a very young boy, maybe, the parents or so can be more intrusive. But if it's an older boy who has no one paying attention to him, right? Then, um, then these things are hidden and suppressed, right? And then lead to problems later on in life. So that is how this formation of masculinity, I think, when we talk about sexuality, it's integral. But what we're doing is it's very harmful sometimes in the way we do it. And that's why we need to have the conversations to break these norms, these myths and so on, these stereotypes, to include the experiences of persons who feel differently and who have had different experiences.
Thanks so much for that, Vidya. Orlando, do you have any thoughts about the way that sexuality tends to divert from or play into ideas related to masculinity, traditional masculinity, that is?
All right, thanks, Akola. I don't want to echo what they just said, but I was thinking along that path because, You see, the thing is, society has already created a structure in what a male role, these gender roles, and what it should be like. And so as a result of that, that we've already have these expectations of what a female, how a female should operate, how a male should be operating. And so when anyone plays into anything that's different to that, then it comes under some sort of scrutiny or, some sort of criticism and things like that. And so when we look at these roles that we've already outlined, anything that is different somehow comes over as wrong, or anything that appears different in terms of whether it be behavior, like Vidya would have mentioned, whether it be beliefs or things like that, it plays in like something is wrong. And so when we look at the stereotypes surrounding masculinity and all of these things, I think that is what has led to so many diversities, in so many criticism as it relates to the male themselves, even as it relates to sexual abuse. So, for instance, you might have a male who might have been sexually abused and might somewhat identify as being gay after. And so people choose not to connect the actual experience with what might have led to the behavior, or something like that. So it's just frowned upon in society. Just they look at mainly his behavior in terms of identifying with gay or things like that. But there's so many underlying causes as to why men do what they do. And a lot of it results in what we would have outlined as what are the roles that are assigned to a male, what are the roles that are assigned to a female. So it has also to do with the culture. Every society might have different culture, and as a result of that, can you hear me still, Nicola? Hello? Yes, I'm sorry, my net is kind of on and off this morning. Yes, so based on the culture and to the traditions that we allow ourselves to believe, a lot of times that plays into also the role of a man, and in terms of masculinity, what we deem masculine in our society. So I didn't want to echo what Vijay said, but I honestly agree with what what he was saying.
Yeah, definitely. I think when it comes to masculinity, it does tend to have a lot of harmful impacts, particularly on all boys and men. When it comes to boys who do not abide by traditional expectations of masculinities, there's just like added barriers for them. And you made a point, Rolando, concerning the way in which boys who are sexually abused, they're often, and who later on in life realize that they might be gay or bisexual and so on, people usually frame that abuse as being a deciding factor for them and their sexuality. How do you think that these perceptions can harm young boys who are survivors of violence?
Is that question directed to me, or it's open a call? Can you go
It
over the
was
question? Can you
directed to
repeat the
you, but
question? Sorry.
it's
Okay, can you repeat the
okay.
question? Okay, can you repeat the question? Sorry, because you
Yeah,
were
certainly,
speaking a
no
bit.
problem. So, sexual abuse is usually framed as being a deciding factor in the way that young boys may sexually identify, particularly if the abuser was a male. So, how do you think that these perceptions can harm young boys who are survivors of sexual violence?
All right, so based on my years of work in the field, I've had a lot of young boys who would have identified, well, before the abuse, they would not have identified themselves as being gay. But after the abuse, they somehow start to believe that, that's where they believe that they belong. And a lot of times when you do the work with them, the trauma work with them, because of the experience and what family members and societies would have, probably those persons who are aware what their experiences were as it relates to the sexual abuse, they were deemed as gay and things like that. I have worked with children, boys, who have identified with that being gay, it was a result of the abuse. And I have worked with boys who identified as being gay, and it was not a result of the abuse. So I have on both spectrums, if you understand. So a lot of times, based on my line of work and my experience thus far, the boys that I've worked with who have who were victims of sexual abuse, when they start to identify as gay, and this is something that, conversations that sometimes we try not to have, it was based a lot of times on the experience of the abuse. So I've had boys, and this is based on my experience, of course. I've had boys who would have said, Miss, I think I'm gay. And I said, okay, why do you think you're gay? They would say, Miss, because while the person was abusing me, I actually had an orgasm. And I actually felt good during the experience. Then I would have had boys who felt like, especially the younger boys who believed that they might have been gay also, because of after they would have had the experience, it came over, they were confused now as to where do they really belong? Do I belong in the female category or do I belong in the male category? And so a lot of times when you have these sessions with these children, especially the boys, and you work through the sessions, and at the end of those trauma work, then they're able to really understand what the experience was like, understand more of what abuse is like, and then they're better able to make that decision if, okay, do you believe they believe they're gay, or maybe it was a result of the abuse and the perception of what persons told me, and the perception of what they perceive themselves as a result of the abuse. So the perception is not always only on people, but a lot of times in their own self, they start to form their own mindset and their own beliefs as to what might have happened, and they form their own beliefs as to what I think happened to me and what I am now as a result of the abuse. And that's something that a lot of times needs to be discussed in different focus groups and forums among these victims of sexual abuse. So it's not only what I'm trying to say, it's not only the perception of others. It's the fact that when you're working with them, it's a lot of they perceive them, a lot of ideas or notions that they perceive themselves as a result of the experience. Do you understand? I'm not sure if I'm clear, but I'm trying
Oh
to.
no, yes, that was
Yes,
that was very
it's
clear.
a lot of times not just society, but it a lot of times relates back to the experience. Then there's the flip side also. It's not just the experience, but it's a lot of times they in themselves would have gravitated to saying, I feel like I am gay. And so it's not just the sexual abuse, and it's not just thinking that it's just the sexual abuse would have led them to believing that they're gay, but there are instances where a lot of times the experience would have made them feel like they were gay. So it's not just the perception of society, but it's also what they have perceived themselves based on whatever experience they would have had, whether it be sexually, whether it be environmental factors, societal beliefs, norm, whatever they would have, their specific world, and the people in their world, and that would have helped to shape some of those perceptions. I'm not sure if
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
certainly.
yes.
It definitely can be a very confusing period for young boys who are
Yeah,
still navigating sexuality and beliefs.
yeah.
Yeah, do you want to touch on this?
Yeah, I think I'm glad Rolanda, started with Rolanda, who from the therapeutic, from the counseling side. This is what is presented afterwards at the end, and these are for the boys who, and for girls as well. I mean, sexual abuse is a traumatic disruption. It's a violation of what should be a normal, like when I use word like sexual knowledge and self knowledge, whether you're gay or straight or however you are, who you like, So, and I think something that we all learn is that all children are affected. So it's not just the boy, all children, and there is a lot of confusion around what it is. But I think we need to emphasize not all gay, bisexual, or other male identified persons who are not heterosexual, not all of them have been abused as children. And I think we've got to make that very clear. And also acknowledging that in our society, is you gay, I make you gay, because as Rolanda said, our bodies are pleasurable. Our bodies can have pleasure, and that one of the difficulties sorry, not one of the difficulties. One of the things about sexual abuse is that it is not always, it comes with coercion, it comes with bribery, it could be a transaction. So somebody has abused you, you get an orgasm, and the person then buys something for you. So it's a so many predators are not violent monsters. You know, when you use the word, they come up in society, they're very nice and friendly and good with children, right? And that is an issue, which is why there's an urgent need for child protection policies and awareness in children. And acknowledging again the source of child links, that wonderful TEL scheme and so that child link had done. So the children learn that not because somebody is nice and they're buying something, do you mean they must touch your body in return, right? So um, really important point. And our Sexual Offences Act now realizes that that any person who's experienced sexual violence, whether child or adult, there can be no defense from the rapist that a person experienced an orgasm. That was a 2010, because that used to be used that, oh, they like it, shit, you know, they wind back or whatever the hell used to go on in our narrative, right? Or they break, you know, the guy got an erection, so therefore, you know, a little child, of course, you know, those things are not, you know, that's a bodily reaction. So it's good to understand, I think, for anyone listening, please do not feel that, you know, you're conflicted because you experienced pleasure and at the same time you felt that you didn't want to do it. It's to understand that it's what your head, that your body might say one thing. And if your head and your body in conflict, um, you're not responsible for that. You're not responsible for the abuse, right? And that the abusers and predators take advantage of this confusion, right? When they move in with this confusion. They move in to take advantage of the need for affection. That what might turn out as attention and love and care, right? Somebody who's buying things for you when maybe other people are not buying, who's giving things to you, who's training you, coaching you, pastoring you, whatever, you know. And when that person asks for something, as if nobody has told you that that is not right, that there's no need for you to give back something like that in return, you know, you become confused when you think instinct that this is not right, you know, because you don't feel right. So so it's important to understand that there isn't the experience on sexual orientation and sexuality is varied, and every survivor, every person who's experienced this, every guy, anybody who's counseling should be open to all the possibilities. And I have known too where there were gay men who might have had experiences of abuse, just like any other child, but it was difficult to form relationships.
Yeah.
They might just go for sex as adults, you know, like a lot of men who go just for sex, but not interested in the dynamics of a relationship, very often have experienced some sort of a trauma in childhood related to sexuality.
Yeah.
Because the way of having sex is a way of trying to regain the power. To say,
Right.
let me go, if I go and initiate this, then I am now back in, you know, it's a way of reclaiming power. And again, the therapeutic ways of trying to understand how do you regain autonomy. It isn't that you have to go out and do back, you know, to say that this is you're in control now of your, no, that, you know, there are other ways of autonomy. There are other ways of you getting back. You know, and really is what us having these open conversations about what the experiences left you with, you know.
Right. Yeah. Because one of the things to add to what Vidya is saying is that a lot of times, especially for the young boys, their first sexual experience might be the abuse. And so I heard him talk about, you know, them being in a relationship and not knowing how to function. And it might not only be relationships as it relates to when they become grown adults, but simple relationships in their lives, whether it be among their peers in school, family members, and all of these things. It just generally alters their mindset. And so the perception on how they perceive the world after the abuse it somewhat changes after the experience. And so it hasn't only changed as a result of thinking that they might be gay or, you know, they're still heterosexual, and having them understand or bringing them to the point to see where they really belong. And because that's what our role as the trauma counselor is. We're not to say, listen, you're not this because of this. We get them to that stage and that place in their life, in the counseling, in the therapeutic work, where they realize this is where, okay, this happened, but okay, I can identify here. So a lot of times their perception in terms of their mindset and how their cognition kind of is altered. So now relationships might not only, and this is for parents too to understand, might not only be as a result of them being in a when they get older, but as they are young now, because their peers, they might become very aggressive. They might become, some boys start to adopt female behaviors as a result, because it's all in a place where they're still trying to figure out. That's those, of course, who would have had the sexual encounters, sexual abuse, sexual violence. So, these are all things that parents and the society needs to understand, that a lot of times the behaviors that are portrayed by boys, whether they perceive it as acceptable or not in society, there must be some kind of underlying factor that like, something that is some causation, something that would have caused them to behave that way. So, when you look at some of the jargons and the slangs thrown, sometimes when you see male operate in a certain way, as a trauma counselor, you tend to see beyond that, and you know that it might not always be the abuse, of course, like Video rightfully said. We have to understand that abuse might not always lead to male behaving that way. But it is something to take into consideration. Huh? And so what I was saying in terms of relationship, it might be the relationship with their family members, the relationship with their classmates, the relationship with a teacher, or somebody else, in relationship with others in the society, in their environment directly. It just generally alters their mindset, and as a result of that, it's manifested in their behavior. So those are all things we need to take into consideration.
Yeah, I think
Yes, that's
just to
very true.
emphasize, sorry, Cole, just to
No, go
emphasize the
ahead.
point, please understand that not every person who experiences attraction, every guy who's experiencing attraction to another guy, that's not because of some sexual abuse or trauma. We got to remember that in the conversation, right? That those attractions are part of our sexuality, however those are formed, right? Um, just to remember that too.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So, a point was made earlier concerning the way that those who have experienced sexual abuse tend to respond or grow, in the sense that a lot of the behaviors they adapt to cope. One of the expectations of traditional masculinity is that males must be strong, they must be resilient when they experience any type of trauma or hardship they need to push through, and of course, when it comes to young boys, this is a lot of added pressure also. So, Vidya, how do you think that these expectations of resiliency can really harm young boys who have experienced sexual violence?
So, as we understand resilience, right? So, Rolanda, just taking up, we understand, if anybody watching over here, we talk about what we mean by resilience. Resilience is how we adapt. Like if something bad happened, how do we adapt and carry on? And they got a whole world that keeps saying, be strong, get up and move on and move on. But the thing is that while we might get up and move on, the harm is done, and if we don't deal with that harm, it could have long-term effects. And it is true that our coping mechanisms, which is what we do. So, like as boys, we get up, we brush off, we wipe, we tear, we don't cry, whatever, we get up and we move. And regardless of sexual orientation, boys and men, many of them are affected the same way, that the resilience is you got to get up and move on, regardless of your sexual orientation. That has been something that I have learned in interacting with men of diverse sexual orientations. So regardless of men who are gay, straight, or whatever, many of us men engage in the toxic, we call it toxic behavior. I am one man as such who also engages that, I am not going to, their beliefs and so that I have to unpack. And I'm very grateful to all the women who have liberated me from some of the stupidness that I used to believe, right? But there's some things that are deeply ingrained that's going to take a long time to come out. And God help me, I mean, I'm already. So this thing about unpacking how we deal with how we have these conversations around sexuality, how we have these conversations around mental health and well-being, and how we've dealt with bad experiences. So what has happened is, and this is what I found, is that I invoked earlier the male survivors of child sexual abuse who I've met. And the group of men that I'm thinking about now, there are men now, and the ones who disclose in different ways. To all intents and purposes in the society, Akola and Rolanda, they are successful men. They're not necessarily prone to any addictions or anything. But what I do know about all of those men is that the loss has been in their ability to have loving, nurturing, intimate relationships. None of those men have been able to have that. And and while they do carry on with their studies, they've done well in other parts of their life, they maintain health, like physical health and things like that. And this is a group of men who I think who've had other positive interventions to help protect, but deep down. And none of these men, one of them, I remember asking, I said, did you bring, you went to therapy for something, thought you'd go for something else. I said, did you bring this back out? Because even when I had a disclosure, it came up in a disclosure to me in a conversation. I don't know, these men are not clients, they're like in a social acquaintances. But none of these guys have brought this up in a therapeutic way because we are right. And to all intents and purposes, they're all right. They're not, the blood sugar and the blood pressure and so on are right. They're attractive. They can get, men and women and whatever as they please. But the ability to have the nurturing. For those with children, one of the guys who I invoked recently is someone who I knew as a younger person, used to be very out as a gay man, and then told me that through his spiritual intervention and church, he acknowledged the abuse that happened, and he no longer identifies as gay, and he's now married to a woman, and he has a strong spiritual connection in faith, right? But that was a kind of like therapeutic space in which he found some addressing some of the problems he might have felt with his sex, because as a young gay man, he did not necessarily have the kinds of relationships that he might have with his wife now. But even outside of church, there are many people who have different experiences in their sexuality. Sexuality can be fluid, it's complicated, it's never straightforward in terms of who people are attracted to, who you want to form relationships with, and so on. So so this tradition is that so the guys get up, the boys get up, or some of them might revert to the toxic things which are encouraged, like drinking. The issues of alcohol, and I am against alcohol. I'm completely zero against alcohol. Those who know me, I'm rabid against it. And there's an alcohol culture which is being pushed, especially at men. Sports organizations, there's a lot of, the Football Federation funding from the alcohol industry. So the alcohol industry pushes that toxicity onto men. And the converse thing is, so boys and so learn that we can drink, we can smoke, we can start to abuse women to get back our power. Any sense of loss of power, what do? We might abuse women or others who we perceive to be weaker. Right? So all of these things now, it prevents the healing and conversations. The trouble is that even those people who might have the skills in Guyana, who might have the skills related to healing and counseling and so, also have these expectations of masculinity. So at any time, any male identifying person who turns up, there's a little bit of eyebrow raise. No man, no man, you too, look at you, you all right. You good looking, you bright, you rich, you whatever, or you know what I mean? So my use a man, you can get over it. Man can get over it. Let me take a beer. Let me take a beer and call me anytime we can take a beer. You can gaff them, we can take a beer and we can drunk. And when we drunk, we can talk about everything and nothing is healed. There's no healing or anything, right? So having a beer is a solution, the space in which some of our problems are talked about. And young boys are schooled in that. Every young boy growing up, and this is another conversation I listened to some young guys. I had this discussion with an 18-year-old boy about the alcohol story. Boys who don't drink and don't want to drink are also deemed unfit because you're easy to see the advertisements which are encouraging men to drink and males to drink. So while they might say, please drink responsibly, the bottom, every drunk man I know has said they were responsible drinkers. So we have all of these things going on which prevent anybody who's experienced this. So that even if there's disclosure, and again, it depends on the age, because like teachers and parents, like for younger boys or younger boys who haven't learned these things as yet, they might just say, look, XYZ did this to me, and therefore you can have it. And I think, Akola and Rolando, if you remind me, the research that Dr. Henry did for y'all, Paula did for y'all, it was in that kind of age group, right? It was under 10? Was it mostly under 10, right? Right. So that was interesting because like when we're having these conversations, what's happening with the teenage boys who end up in transactional situations, who have a little bit more self-cognitive thing and self-preservation in them, and then the adult men, the adult men who are going around who have survived all of this and can't talk about it except maybe when they're drunk, right? So yeah, it is a problem that how we perform our masculinity, how we want males and masculinity to be in this country, the contradictions around it, it does prevent, it is going to prevent a lot of the boys and young men who have experienced child sexual abuse and other forms of child abuse, because sometimes the child sexual abuse is not happening alone. There could be neglect happening, there's physical violence happening, parents beating a child who might be behaving, being effeminate or something or whatever, not understanding. There's all sorts of vulnerabilities that are interlinked, right? So, so it's a lot of work to be done to unpack.
Yeah, certainly. There's a lot of expectations of masculinity and all that, particularly when it comes to just kind of pushing through. Rolanda, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. So while Vidya was talking, I thought about our numbers in terms of reporting. The expectancy, of course, of resiliency as it relates to male. It has indeed caused somewhat harm to our boys and men in our society. So I've never had much encounter, to be honest, in my experience with male survivors of adult male survivors of sexual abuse. But I can speak as it relates to the work that we do here at CAC as it relates to the boys. Our boys reporting figure, it's so low. And the fact that it's that low is because of course, when a male is abused, then we know what are some of the things that society usually say. They connect them to all kind of labels, and of course, the shame that comes with it in confessing that just by saying and disclosing that you have been sexually abused as a boy. It not only just has to do with, you're ashamed to say you're sexually abused, but what will society think of me now as a boy? Because we connect rape and any form of sexual abuse mainly to females. And so when young men or boys come, especially, okay, so let me say this. For the years that I have done work in this field, I can say that teenage boys are among the lowest numbers of those who report sexual abuse among males. You have them coming mainly among the younger boys who might disclose and say, this person did this to me then. And that's happening now more because, of course, children are being educated to speak out. Like Vidya would have mentioned, the TEL scheme that teaches them to, to say when or to speak up when they have been abused sexually. So you have the younger boys who are reporting, but as it relates to the teenage boys who are more conscious of culture and who are more conscious of the stigma that might be identified with someone who have been sexually abused as a male, then they report the least, at least as it relates to the work that I have done in this field so far. So in terms of the resiliency and having them bounce back and what are society's expectation of them bouncing back when this happens, then the few teenage boys that I have worked with, and I can give you some practical examples because it is the field that I work with in. So one of the things that they usually say is that, Miss, I didn't want to say, maybe I should have said then and not now. Because they feel like somehow it's more safe to disclose when you're small because they see me as a little kid and I didn't know better and I might not be able to defend myself. So it's easy for me to say then than it is for me to say now as a teenager. I remember I had a case a while back and it was a young boy who was raped, a teenage boy was raped, and this is a boy. And I remember him really being traumatized by what happened and could not come to grip as to why what he basically was trying to say is that only females should be raped. Being abused as a kid is one thing by somebody who took advantage of you, but me now as a teenager being, held down and raped, then something is definitely wrong. And so he was really traumatized and he couldn't understand, even his family couldn't understand why, how is this possible? So him bouncing back took so much more time than if it was a younger boy. And so the different stages of development also plays into that factor in terms of how boys will bounce back. So I have my little boys that I work with and so on, and they're you can work around them because they're more receptive of the information that is being shared. They're more receptive of the therapeutic work that is that they're going through. Unlike a teenager who is more conscious of what society might say as a result of that, they're more conscious of their friends and their peers, and of course, they're still at a stage of where they're being able to identify with who they really are as a person. So that's where sometimes the confusion comes for the teenagers, even though they might say, okay, this is where I am, and but this thing happened, and and that's where the therapeutic work is so profound and it's effective, so that they're able to better understand what happened. And bouncing back, always, I would say, it takes more work as a therapeutic counselor to get the teenagers, boys, to bounce back. And in terms of resiliency, as we're talking about, than the younger boys, right? And so it does indeed affect them at all levels. But in terms of the challenges, like I would have shared, I would have experienced. I've never had the male-like video experience. Is quite different from mine. But for teenager boys, I find that it's harder for them to more identify with just seeing themselves that they were the victim and it's not their fault. And that's something that we need to also keep including our conversations, that any time sexual abuse occurs, it's never your fault, and that it's the person who just seeks to have control. The perpetrator's main focus is control, and because they can't have that control, they of course take advantage of that factor. So the report numbers, you can see it's least among boys and it's least among teenage boys in terms of my experience. But the younger boys, most of my boys are very young boys who have not understood the full ramifications of if you do say that you have been sexually abused as a boy. So that too we need to understand.
Cool. I just want, because Rolando raised something really critical here. It's understanding this perception that by children, which is usually like 1 to 8, when they talk about children, it's like 1 to 8, because even teenage girls might also have different experiences in terms of how and when and what's going on too, right? Because and I think I get the impression a lot of teenage situations with true pregnancy, there's a whole set of reasons how teenage sex, for the girls, but But it's this idea that in our society that we only protect the younger children, and there's this tension about trying to understand, like when the children become like 10, 11, or at least high school age, yes, the boys want to be men. God knows since I was 11, I was a big man. As soon as the first hair come out, and I know that. But at the same time, is how do you provide the protective thing to say, hey, this can happen to you. And if anybody does anything to you, let me know. To keep that thing going, that conversation of what else could happen to you. And that is where that vulnerability, and I think, the abusers take advantage of that time as well. And the vulnerability might come through not only in terms of physical, but the mental, social, dealing with these expectations. So then, for the boys who experience anything, they get up and pick up and are expected to deal with things on their own, which is why suicide rates are higher among male men, attempts to suicide on boys, and so I think, made that point. I think this is an important point as well to make. As we're doing just the wellness check, anybody who's watching this video or just tuned in the middle here, counseling, and I think Rolanda Yukola Childlink is up to 18, right? Anybody up to 18, right? So
Yes, in the
anybody up to
cities.
18 who has experienced this and wants to talk about this. And I think any adult could have an initial conversation, and y'all will help with necessary referrals. Am I correct? Right? I say you're a 21-year-old man and you feel that you want to talk about this now. Talk to Childlink, or Help and Shelter also has counseling available, and then you can have the referrals to have the deeper work done. Right? So please, if anybody's listening and you think anyone's had these experiences and want to talk about what has happened, please reach out to a counselor or somebody else who will understand and empathize and work with them. Please feel free to do that. And the point being made that we should also talk to teenage boys as well, right? As children. Like the thing with the TEL scheme that I used to is that I was glad that TEL scheme worked for a certain age group. I kept thinking, well, but I think the bigger people need to know about the TEL scheme too. Yeah, I mean, we have people believe that they can touch women and girls' bodies and say what they want in this country about women and girls, right? Anywhere, anybody can throw comments, right?
Yeah.
Every woman's body, any man on the road think he could say anything about a woman and a girl or her body, right? So there's a lot of work going on there, and the impact on the boys who survive this is that they're made to feel feminized, and apparently being feminized is a bad thing. So that's another story that we got going on, because for many men, for masculinity in Guyana and the Caribbean, especially, and probably around the world, the worst thing you can be called as a woman or be mistaken for as a woman or a girl. So for so many of us, and I have a girl name, and people are always shocked when they deep apologies to me when they realize that I'm not woman, right? And they keep telling me, oh, they're so sorry you got my name. And I'm like, nothing's wrong. A woman is a good thing to be to, there's no harm. But you can see in the society, which comes from women and men, that what being feminine is supposed to be less or bad compared to being whatever we have. And we got to really deal with that as well. This isn't only happening at one level. There's just so many things that we have to unpack. Child sexual abuse is a part of a larger culture of violence. And the experience of men is how men experience violence generally, how they perpetrate violence, and how they experience violence as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. It's such a wide area, and you really need to keep the fire burning from all ends to ensure that we're effectively responding to and supporting young boys and men who have experienced sexual violence. So we're to our end, and I was curious if you had any final thoughts you would like to share, any messages you believe are important for those who might be watching.
Cola, could you repeat? I missed you a bit. Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, I'm hearing you better. I don't know.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was saying that today's conversation was really enlightening in a lot of ways, and I'm really glad that we're having these discussions. And so we're almost to our end now. So if you have any final thoughts or messages you would like to share with those who might be watching, please feel free to do so.
All right. If I may, I wanted to say to the general public, as a trauma counselor, I've worked with a lot of people from different cultures, different status. Child sexual abuse, it doesn't come with a status or a culture, or it happens. It's one of the phenomenon in our society. I would always say to the public and those persons who are listening, get the necessary help. Do not think that sexual abuse, it's one that you can just overcome just like that. Sometimes you need professional intervention. Get the necessary help. I see the damage that sexual abuse can have on an individual, whether it be male or female. It has rippling effects, like Vidya would have mentioned, into your adult life. So whether you're a teenager, a child, or parent, or even an adult that's listening, I've had adults who would have had encountered in sexual abuse, maybe since a child, or maybe the perpetrator is dead, but it has messed up their life in such a way that they can't move on. It's a struggle to move on. That's where you know for a fact that if you're struggling in that area, then you need professional help. Get the help that's needed. We have child advocacy centers in Region 3, 4, 5, 6, and Blossom also there's an organization called Blossom that does support also in trauma work. You can reach out to us, you can reach out to Child Protection, you can contact any of these agencies. Of course, Vidya would have mentioned Help and Shelter. They do support also in this area, but get the help needed because it has rippling effects outside of just the abuse, and you might be suffering in silence. Do not do so. Sexual abuse cannot be dealt with in isolation. It needs intervention. So seek the help that's needed and report children. If anybody would have violated your body in any way or you felt uncomfortable in any way, ensure to report. Tell the adult that you trust the most and let them report to the necessary agency. All right? So that is it on my part.
So first of all, Cole, just to say thanks again to Chilling for this work, for keeping this work going, and for opening up this conversation a little bit more. Just a key message that any man who might identify as gay, bisexual, or born male but have a different gender identity, any man who feels different, or any male or boy, if you feel different from what the society tells you you should be, that's okay. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and go and find out, and be who you are. Um, for those persons who have had experienced child sexual abuse or any other form of child abuse, and you've been told, man, get up and look, man, that happened to all of we. That's part of growing up, and there's rites of passage, right? Everybody got to go through that and so on. Your abuser could have been a woman too, right? We're talking about this, whether the abuser is male or female. Um, if you feel that you need to talk about it, please go and talk about it. Find out. And even if you don't want to talk about it, there are a lot of YouTube clips. There's resources online for you to tap into. So please feel free to go and explore it. It might open up traumatic things, and so it's a process. But remember, healing. Healing is that. Don't feel be aware of what's happening to you. Don't engage in alcohol or drugs or anything as you deal with your problems. Go and get help. For people who provide care and help, even if you're well intentioned, just be mindful that men and boys would have also might have survived child sexual abuse. Please don't assume that every gay person you meet is a survivor of child sexual abuse. On the other hand, please assume that every gay person you meet, that any person you meet, you don't know how many persons have survived child sexual abuse. And therefore, for providers of care, please be compassionate and have empathy. And if you cannot do that and you cannot deal with it, please make referrals. ChildLink, we're a community. It's all the different organizations. And so we got to do this as community. It's not one-on-one. We also have to keep education going, teaching our children, boys and girls, about bodily integrity, about consent, right? We got a lot of work to do around that. There are alternative forces. One of the greatest fears I had with school opening during getting COVID is that the minibus thing starting back again. I was in a minibus at 3 o'clock, the nasty, dirty music and everything. So, so COVID was one thing, but like that is another. So I might be, we're gonna be doing this here and trying to take donor money to do that, while there are other forces who want to maintain the negativity and the poison, right? And this is a systemic thing, right? So who do you go with? The nice flashy minibus people who play in the thing, like the two who drunk the two girls from the Essequibo, and that's happening throughout this country because that they aren't found, because the children go home and nobody recognizes that they're drugged or drunk. So we got a lot of things to this child protection issue is all over, and so hoping that we also look at these cultural issues. We've got to address these cultural issues which prevent healing and the transformation necessary for productive society, and one which is about growth and not destruction, as we see in Benton. Thanks so much, Kola.
Growth and not destruction. I think that's such a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much again, Vidya and Rolanda, for being with us here today and sharing your thoughts and perspectives. It's been really, really educational. So hope to speak to you both again sometime soon, and take care. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.